I'm your host, Demetria Wack.
And I'm your host, Michael Wiafe.
Today on PolicyWise.
The role specifically was working on trying to steer cannabis tax revenues back to communities of color impacted by the war on drugs.
We saw the transformation of the public discourse around marijuana.
This money can be going to something like very positive, or, it could be going to something that might have really negative consequences for the groups that were already disadvantaged from super restrictive marijuana laws.
How could the state, take a big picture look at this and see, is this really making a difference in the communities that were most impacted by the war on drugs?
So there was that large transformation from it being kind of more of an underground thing to something that you can be driving and see a huge billboard.
But we'll go into that a little bit more later. The roots of racialized drug laws and drug enforcement are deeply ingrained to our criminal justice systems. The war on drugs, starting in the 1970s, drove this discrimination against people of color, specifically Black people of color, deep into families, communities, and institutions, driving families into poverty, separating children from their families, and creating generations of cumulative disadvantage. The enforcement of marijuana laws has played a particularly large role in this process.
As an increasing number of states legalize marijuana, there's a debate where money raised from this industry should be spent. Youth Forward is an organization dedicated to improving health, education, and well-being of our most vulnerable children and youth through policy advocacy, education, and community action. They've become a leading voice for racial equity and community reinvestment in regards to cannabis legislation in California.
Today we have two members from Youth Forward, Executive Director Jim Keddy and Policy Advocate Sarah Michael Gaston.
Sarah, Michael, and Jim, could you please introduce yourselves, who you are, how you ended up at Youth Forward, and specifically involved in this topic?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Michael Gaston. I'm the policy advocate with Youth Forward, and Youth Forward is a nonprofit that supports vulnerable youth and youth of color, trying to advocate for more public investments for them and reduce the criminalization of young people. How I ended up at Youth Forward, I had a friend of Jim's, and after college, I did an informational interview with him. And in 2019, he had a position available and asked me if I was interested, and it combined social justice, public health, and young people. And so I was all in. And the role specifically was working on trying to steer cannabis tax revenues back to communities of color impacted by the war on drugs. So that's how I got involved in this topic of cannabis legalization.
Yeah, I'm Jim Keddy, and I have had a long career in the community organizing field in California. I started working as an organizer in 1987 in Oakland. And over the years, I've worked on a lot of different issues. I've worked in state policy. I've worked locally on very local neighborhood issues. I started to pay attention to cannabis legalization in 2016 when it started to look to me like Prop 64 was going to pass. And I just got curious about it. So I went in and I read the long ballot measure. I actually read it several times, and a couple of things just stood out to me right away. One is that this was an issue that had a long racialized history in California, and that people had been, Black and brown people had been going to prison for decades for now what was going to be a legal industry, mostly driven by white entrepreneurs. So that really stood out to me. And then the second thing that stood out was, wow, this is going to generate a lot of revenue and profit. Where's the money going to go? Government's going to collect revenue. How is government going to spend the money? And then also the industry would generate profits for individuals, for business owners. What's that going to look like? And as I looked more and more into it, what struck me is that this would be something worth paying attention to. So I started a new nonprofit called Youth Forward to work on it. And for the first year, it was really my dog and I in the living room, kind of figuring out, building a nonprofit, starting to engage with other people and talk to other people about what this could mean and learn more about the world of cannabis, which was new to me. I never really worked on drug policy. So I had kind of a steep learning curve, but it was fun and it was relevant and it was urgent.
So I think I have a very interesting, and I'm sure Demi has a similar, I guess, viewpoint in terms of we saw the transformation of the public discourse around marijuana and also just like the advertising of it. There's a very big difference from when I was in high school to college and the way that it would be discussed, in the way that people would acquire it as well. And so there was that large transformation from it being kind of more of an underground thing to something that you can be driving and see a huge billboard, and have it up there. So I'm curious with all of this new, I guess, cash flow, where is money currently going and where should it be going?
So the money is currently going to four and more, but the ones that we track and look at are 4 state grant programs, and they are run by state agencies like Department of Healthcare Services, Department of Education, and the California Natural Resources Agency, the Board of State and Community Corrections, and then the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. And so with those main grant programs, some of the language in Prop 64 already showed where the money should be going, and that was the California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. It specifically talked about repairing some of the harm that had been caused by the war on drugs and going back into, marginalized communities. And so with that one was the first one we started working on and trying to shape so that it really was grounded in communities that were supporting these communities and providing social services like addressing barriers to reentry, with legal services and as well as substance use prevention and treatment. And so that one was really great. But, one of the things that we were trying to further help guide the implementation was we don't want the money split up in these 6 different social service areas to have a specific number for the money. So the money, I think it was maybe 20 million to start with. And they were thinking, let's put 5 million in this pot and 5 million for this social service. We were you should let applicants apply for a multitude of services because they're already doing more than one specific task. And so that was where we could be this is what community-based organizations on the ground have said would be beneficial to them, and making the application not so cumbersome, not so long, and allowing some of the money to be given up front, versus them having to spend money and then get a reimbursement. So those were some of the things that we advocated for. And then the other 3 grant programs, we really had to get in from the beginning. And when they were, announcing the grant program and then having meetings to shape it, we had to go in and be this is what happened with the war on drugs, and this is why we need to ensure that there's racial justice and equity as you roll out, these dollars. And so that's what we've, been able to do. And I think for the most part, all of the state agencies have been receptive to our feedback. I think, it helped that we were kind of some of the first people in the space trying to shape, the money, and they saw that we had, credibility as, stakeholders, and we made sure to make a lot of connections and relationships across the state to uplift the work that they're doing and, give their advice and put that forward when we were meeting with the policymakers and the decision makers at all of the state agencies. So there's, Jim, if you want to add, anything to that.
Yeah, I would just add to what Sarah said that so far the state has awarded about $100 million to nonprofits working in communities of color, and the money grows every year. as the cannabis industry grows and sends more tax revenue to the state. I think by the end of this year, it'll be about $175 million. And then in addition to those 4 grant programs that Sarah described, the state's also using a pretty big chunk of Prop 64 cannabis revenue for child care. So it's helping expand child care access in California.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, I was just about to ask because it seems like most of the way in which this money is going back and kind of, fighting these deeply ingrained cycles of poverty is through grant programs. But through this child education program, is it linked to this kind of overall feeling of, stopping disadvantage, through like hitting it, early on in the cycle? Is that the perception of the early education programs?
It is, yeah. But certainly the state's use of the dollars for childcare is supporting the lowest income and low income families in the state. For sure.
I wanted to ask because this is so new and the way that it's functioning is through grant programs, which is also often hard to kind of track the impact of, and, tracking the impact ends up putting like additional pressure on those organizations and different things like that. How are you, measuring the impact that this money is having, and, what would make you feel like you've accomplished all that you've wanted to accomplish?
Now, I guess I would say that, we're watching, we've seen a lot of terrific organizations that we know do great work. We've seen a lot of organizations receive those dollars. So we have a lot of confidence that, those community-based organizations are doing terrific work with these new funds. Now, what's not written into state law, which was not written into Prop 64, was any kind of mechanism to do like a big picture evaluation. And that's something that I think we'll be advocating for in the near term, in the next year or two. How could the state, take a big picture look at this and see, is this really making a difference in the communities that were most impacted by the war on drugs? But that function was not part of the initial ballot measure legislation. Yeah. I wanted to also add that this revenue that is collected from cannabis at the state level is only one part of the picture. So local cities and counties that have legal marijuana businesses, they're collecting revenue too. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that those cities and counties are, for the most part, just spending those new dollars on what they already do. The money goes to the general fund of a city or of a county. And with that, it means that a good chunk of that money is going to law enforcement and general government services. And in some cases, cities have created specialized new law enforcement units that are supposed to be out there cracking down on the underground economy or the illegal market. So we've been kind of hitting the alarm bell about that and encouraging groups at the local level to organize to have their city's dollars or their county dollars directed to the neighborhoods, the black and brown neighborhoods that are impacted by the war on drugs, and not just have the money disappear into government, or certainly not to expand law enforcement, because I don't think anyone voted to legalize marijuana with the goal of expanding law enforcement. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, wow, that's really interesting. And I think, with that, you brought up two really like different sides of this, which is this money can be going to something like very positive, or, it could be going to something that might have really negative consequences for the groups that were already disadvantaged, from like super restrictive marijuana laws. Looking at that and seeing how marijuana laws are changing across the entire nation, has there been, do you know what the dialogue is in states that have just recently legalized marijuana, as well as have we been, as California, looking to, say, Colorado and Oregon for ways that we can move forward and productively spend this money?
Yeah, so the early states that legalized, like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, pretty much did it without paying any attention to racial equity. So we followed in California, and I think we've, big picture, have probably done a better job than those other early states. But some of the states that have followed us in legalizing, like Illinois, have also included language in their measures about directing tax revenue to the communities most impacted by criminalization. So we're seeing that now as more states legalize. There's been more attention paid to doing some repair of the harm caused by the war on drugs. But it's a lot to pay attention to be honest with you. There's really no national conversation about this. It's happening kind of state by state. There's no like national advocacy push on it. And there really should be, because there's so much money at stake.
So I'm really curious. There was a state that expunged all records for people who were locked up on marijuana possession charges. What is California kind of doing around that, around people who are currently locked up for something that is now legal? Has there been any movement on this? Do you know?
I don't know which state that is. I know it's not California, but we have been taking measures to expunge people's records that have marijuana misdemeanors or felonies, and we were able to expunge about 6,000 records in the Sacramento area. And that was, some of it was completely clearing records, some of it was reducing a felony to a misdemeanor. And the exact, moment as of 2021, May, we're in May, where that is, but we have been working on it and we are seeing progress.
Yeah, Sarah mentioned we made some good progress here in Sacramento, but there are other counties that still have lots of people in that county who have cannabis offenses on their record and should have their records changed. And we've been trying to look at which are those counties and what can be done about it.
So it looks like we're having somewhat of a, fortunately and unfortunately, depending on who you're talking to, it's a very localized approach into, how different counties or cities decide to handle the situation. I looked it up, and it looks like it's the state of Illinois that expunged minor cannabis offenses for possession or dealing, having 30 grams or less, and below June 25th, 2019. So that's what I found on Illinois. And so I remember when it first came out, it was a big kind of thing, and it was all over social media, that basically anyone with those charges, can get out. And I feel like California can look at doing something similar, possibly.
Yeah, I can add some more detail on that. We did work on state legislation in 2018 with the goal of having all records cleared in California for cannabis offenses. And it created a process where the Department of Justice created a list of everyone in the state that would be eligible. The Department of Justice then sent the list to the district attorneys who looked it over and were then responsible for giving it to the courts. And the courts have been dragging their feet in getting those records cleared. Some counties have moved quickly and others have moved slowly. So that was my earlier comment about some counties have yet to really move on it. And this year we attempted to introduce another piece of legislation that would force those counties that are dragging their feet to act. And unfortunately, in the way the bill process worked, the bill is currently not live, but we are continuing to push to see if we could have language added to accomplish that in the sort of trailer bill process that's going to be happening in the next month or two.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think the actual legal courts is something that we don't get to talk about a ton on the podcast. So thank you for bringing it up. I do want to move into other work that your organization does. And that's also, while you promote kind of like this regeneration through the legalization money, there's also this other side where you want to make sure that young folks are careful with the use of cannabis and aren't using it, and that certain industries aren't taking advantage of young people by promoting to them. Could you maybe clarify what I just said to the rest of the listeners, or kind of just go a little bit more into that work?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in again on this one. So we have been tracking the health research on cannabis use for quite some time now. And what you can see is more and more evidence that frequent cannabis use by adolescents and young adults not good for brain development. And in some cases, it can trigger schizophrenia, psychosis. It's particularly risky if young people are using cannabis products with really high levels of THC. And the cannabis industry has been driving the whole market towards higher and higher levels of THC. So cannabis has two kind of basic components. THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient that makes you high and affects your brain, and then CBDs. And when you look at medical cannabis, those are predominantly CBD products. So the more CBD in cannabis, the less THC. The more THC, the less CBD. But the markets move towards these higher and higher concentrated cannabis products, shatter, dabs, wax, a lot of vaping is very super high THC. And in our view, we should move towards regulating the cannabis industry just like we regulate other industries and put caps on THC levels. Sometimes you find with people who are older, they think of cannabis as like whatever they did when they were younger. And, they might have smoked weed when they were in their early 20s or when they were a college student. But the reality is that what they experienced 20, 30 years ago is quite different than what people are using today. And the industries, just like tobacco industry, is looking to make a product more addictive. And there is, about 10% of cannabis users do have an addiction problem. And that number has been growing steadily as the amount of THC goes up. So it's some, there is kind of this common perception that cannabis is harmless or it's a universal health product. But in fact, that's not the case, and the research shows something different. The other population that has to be really careful around cannabis is pregnant women. And pregnant women, more and more pregnant women are using cannabis for nausea and for, issues around being pregnant. But unfortunately, there is a clear, using cannabis when you're pregnant increases your risk for low birth weight, stillbirths. So it's dangerous. But that's also part of something that's not really known. And, I do think we have to start looking at this in a serious way because it's just going to get out of hand, and you can't count on industry to regulate itself. The industry is about making money, bottom line. And, we've seen, whether it's tobacco or alcohol, these are basically predatory industries, and cannabis is one as well.
Yeah, that's why I think it's important to raise awareness about the negative impacts of cannabis, because the brain is still developing until we're about 25 years old. And there are, young people getting pregnant, as well. And so that's something that we, have to educate people about, is that it's not all just medicinal and, has huge health benefits. There are some, drawbacks. And we really do want to protect, our future generations, our young people and our pregnant young people.
So I'm actually really glad that you both brought that up. Really, I was thinking about the similarities between the tobacco industry and how the marijuana industry might be leaning in that direction, just a little bit. And so I guess my question then, as they are very much so predatory industries that are trying to make as much money and trying to get people more hooked on their vices, I guess what policy changes or what should we be thinking about in order to stop the marijuana industry from creating the level of damage that we kind of saw with the tobacco industry and even the alcohol industry, to the point where they had a Congress passed legislation to amend the Constitution to ban it all. So I guess what should we be thinking about doing on a statewide scale. And then I assume that some of this is going to hit national. So how can we preemptively create legislation that might steer it in the right direction, I guess?
Yeah. We work closely with a public health leader, Dr. Lynn Silver, who's at the Public Health Institute. Her project is called Getting It Right from the Start. And Dr. Silver has created a whole template for how cities and counties and the state can further regulate the cannabis industry to, for example, put caps on THC levels, to reduce youth marketing. So like we just, as a state, for the, a huge step forward, we banned flavored tobacco products, right? And flavored vaping and all that. It was all used to hook young people. Bubble gum flavor, mango flavor. Well, the cannabis industry has cannabis flavored soda pop, cannabis candy, gummy bears. It's all very, it's all marketing to youth, young people on billboards. I got an email the other day from somebody down in Oceanside in her city. I just given a permit to a local manufacturer that sells marijuana vaping pens, and the video they used to promote their vaping pen showed this young woman who could have been anywhere from 16 to 21. So all the old tobacco game plan of getting young people hooked is just being repeated here by the industry. Unfortunately, I would say the state leadership, the legislature, the governor have been largely, they've been resistant to looking at this. They're forming a new consolidated Department of Cannabis Control, and Dr. Silver and I have been urging them to have a strong public health component in that new department. And we'll find out if they took our recommendations when the governor comes out with his May revision of the state budget in a few weeks, in a week or two. But I don't know. We got a long ways to go on this one. There's a lot of ignorance, lack of education, and then also just people wanting to, politicians taking campaign contributions from cannabis industry, chasing cannabis money for their city budget. We have a lot of work to do.
Oh man, that's so interesting. I've been in London for most of the year, and there it's like it's totally legal, and I'm sorry, totally illegal. And coming back here, I think like even in like the year that I've gone, things have just changed so much. And I had a friend call me the other day because her mom just like went to the store and accidentally got it was like weed infused olive oil for like cooking. And the mom was like freaking out, and she was like, I have to be so careful now. I have to like look at everything. And there's just so much that's going to happen with it. And I could just imagine if this happened to just someone that I know, how it's happening to everyone else. So it's very interesting, and it'd be great to track. I do have a question, and this is for Sarah Michael. And we talked about a little bit the impact on women, specifically pregnant women, but you are a former board member and community organizer for Black Women United. And in what ways do you see that these policies impacting, Black women in particular?
Well, I think, specifically back to the war on drugs, which I think you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, and how that has impacted communities of color. And what you touched on, I think, was that it has deprived generations of Black and Brown communities from accumulating generational wealth that, would allow them to possibly be involved in, the cannabis industry. And so I think that with Black women in particular, separating of families and making it hard to get, employment and or housing, that impacts Black women at, I feel like, increasing, rates. When we talk about the cannabis industry and how it's currently dominated by white investors and white owners, like that's an issue because there's still people locked up And so when, Black women are wanting to get into the, business themselves and accumulate or generate some of that wealth, they're experiencing a lot of roadblocks to, get a license or start, a startup, because the fees are high. And then they also are seeing that, the local jurisdictions are putting a cap on the amount of licenses that they can have in their, city or county. So it's already like oversaturated with all these wealthy, white people. And so I think that's, just a really good point, because I think like just specifically, men and women, there are more men in the industry, in the cannabis industry than women. And so even more so Black women are, not seeing that, the equity there of being able to enter the industry.
And that's like such a good point too. I'm in Berkeley right now, and I've been here for about a year. I went with some of my friends down to Oakland, which isn't too far away. It's like a 10-minute drive or so. We were walking down the street, and I remember just seeing this really nice looking store, and I was like, what is that? And I remember we were just like, oh, like let's just go in, whatever. And we go in, and it's a dispensary. But when I tell you, it was like an Apple store. Like I was just so like, I guess I've just never thought of like a store that would be selling drugs to just be like so high tech, and they had like, different ways of like testing it out and all this. And I'm like, what is going on here? I definitely remember hearing some of my friends talking about picking up from the plug behind the gas station, like, and just that level of transformation, it is very intense. And really, I don't know how else to describe it other than gentrification. I mean, it's like the gentrification of the entire industry,
Mm-hmm.
And how that affects, people's cash flows. And, we still have people locked up for it. And that entire industry is no longer what it used to be, literally 5 years ago. And so we have to think of ways to at least try to get, try to build some institutional wealth around that for the communities that have been affected, but also have been like carrying the survival of the industry. And even were basically the ones that got it to pass, and made it more available. Anyway, there's my quick rant. I realize that we're kind of coming up near the hour. And want to thank you both for being here, and want to ask, what is your advice to young people and policy professionals who are listening or possibly listening to this conversation, thinking about these topics and thinking about how it plays in their day-to-day lives? What advice would you have for them, as they move forward and go into different industries and, think about how they all, interact? Maybe Jim, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'd encourage folks to get involved in this issue at the local level, to figure out what your city's doing or your county. Think about how you think this should be happening, and to make your voice be heard on it, because it's just going to get bigger. It's just going to generate more money, and more cities are going to have legal businesses. So how they go about doing all of that is super important. And there are both opportunities here and threats. So yeah, I'd encourage folks to get involved locally. And certainly if people want to connect with us, we're happy to support any local effort or help people learn more about this kind of policy area. So please don't hesitate to contact me or Sarah.
I would agree with Jim. Get involved locally, and a starting point would just be to call or email your city manager and ask the direct questions that you're looking for, like how is cannabis legalized in my city, because that might be a question you need an answer to. Where, if it is legalized, where are those tax revenues going, and just go from there, because sometimes it can be challenging just doing a Google search, like looking for that information, because oftentimes it's not there. It's just hard to find. And so just call directly to your local government to find out that information. And like Jim said, we'd be more than glad to assist you or support you in figuring this all out, because we really, support youth leadership and in youth organizing, getting involved to, make the change that you want to see. And I'm trying to, think what else. I think also, possibly trying to reduce the stigma around about being involved in this type of like work, like caring about where cannabis tax revenues are going. And I think that even what I've seen is that jobs are hard to come by, especially for young people, but we need to make that a priority. We need to give young people the skills to work and so in one of those areas, I think that there's probably stigma is being involved in the cannabis industry, working at a dispensary or something. But it's just like, how do we talk about that shift of why is it overwhelmingly dominated by white people, that are cultivating and selling at these legal, dispensaries. It should be people of color, and it should be, people of color that are receiving these licenses and are receiving, money from their local governments to, have a business. So I think, getting involved in that way, I think is valid, if that's something that you want to do. And so I just want to encourage that.
So I know I said that was kind of our last question, but I have a quick follow-up. Now that I'm starting to think about it, I feel like this might be a more challenging space for young people to get involved than maybe other policy areas, because there's also the added stigma might not be the word, but I feel like as a young person, if I go to a legislator and say like, we have to relax our cannabis rules, or we have to do something like this, they're just gonna look at me and be like, that's just because you want more, or that's because you want it to be cheaper, or not necessarily taking us as seriously as thinking about the policy issue, but thinking about us more in that context. Is that something that you've seen or have encountered at all, or that you think is a problem?
I can't say exactly. I think over in general, regardless of how old you are, I feel like legislators are hesitant to move on, cannabis policy and specifically to regulate it and reduce or not reduce the fees, but increase the fees. The cannabis industry wants to reduce the fees, and we want to increase the fees so that those revenues can go back into the communities that were negatively impacted by drug policies. So I can't speak exactly to, I think, how they view young people doing this advocacy, but I think that is a great point you bring up, Michael, because it probably is something that is in their minds. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, I was just going to add that here in Sacramento, we've been supporting our friend and colleague Malachi Sekuaman, who's been leading a campaign with the city to have the city provide extra supports to people of color who want to get into the cannabis industry. And our view is, for people who come from communities that were impacted by the war on drugs, that they should get extra support. Reduced fees or no fees, loans, startup funds, technical support. So that's kind of one category of the cannabis industry that frankly is very small. But for the larger kind of big cannabis, the kind of cannabis industry that the tobacco industry is investing in, that is, really mostly 99% white entrepreneurs. That industry, I think, should be taxed and should be, we should be, their profit margins some of that should be going back into communities impacted by the war on drugs. So it's sort of a complex issue and it takes a while. It's got a lot of different nuances. There's also this whole issue around the environment and the long history of illegal grows on tribal lands. So there's a lot to it. There's a lot to talk about.
It feels like there should be a policy that taxes these bigger cannabis companies, and that money goes into generating startup money for young women of color to open their own cannabis industries, and and then you can
or to open any other kind of business.
Totally.
The war on drugs had a negative economic impact on people of color for decades and decades, right? So the profits of this could also go towards helping people of color start businesses of any kind, right?
Yeah, definitely.
In my view, right?
No, it's super interesting, and I know that I learned a lot, and I know our listeners too. And I just want to say thank you to you both for joining us and for all the work that you're doing. And we'll make sure to put the links to your contacts to Youth Forward so that people can reach out if they're interested, and tell you all about the stuff that they're doing as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of PolicyWise. We are your hosts, Demetria
And Michael.
Michael and I would love to hear from you. What topics would you like to hear about, and who would you like to hear from?
Check the episode description for a link to our survey. Thanks. PolicyWise is a production of Youth Leadership Institute in partnership with California Forward and their Young Leaders Advisory Council.
Youth Leadership Institute makes sure young people are at the decision-making tables across California.
And California Forward leads a statewide movement, bringing people together across communities, regions, and interests to improve government and ensure that the economy works for everyone.
Jarrett Ramones produced this episode. Social media graphics created by Abby Pugh. And the music was sourced from artlist.io.
If you want to find more great youth content, check out YLI.org and be sure to subscribe to PolicyWise on iTunes and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a review. It really helps.
To discuss this episode, engage with us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PolicyWisePod, and hashtag your discussions with hashtag PolicyWise.
See you next time for more youth voice and policy discussion here on PolicyWise.